The first panel this morning is on Tunisia and Egypt. There are 3 speakers. The first speaker is, and they will each speak for, something short of 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments. Our first speaker is Eric Gob, and his bio and those of the other speakers can be found in your program material. But let me just say briefly that he is coming to us from the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, and also but he's currently resident in Morocco at the Centre Jacques Berck in Rabat. And he will be giving a presentation on lawyers and revolution, political mobilization, and professional power in Tunisia.
It's my first presentation in English, and I don't speak a fluent English. I speak English like a Spanish cow. It's a French expression, poor Spanish cows. So I'm going to read my paper. On January 14th, 2011, after 23 years in power and 1 month of popular protest, President Ben Ali fled Tunisia. By taking part in these demonstrations, lawyers lent their support to the uprising, and in so doing, both the profession as a whole and its leaders gained considerable symbolic capital for the post-authoritarian period. The bar's involvement in the protest movement is closely linked to the way in which Ben Ali's regime tried to control the profession. The Tunisian Bar Association operated as a sort of democratic enclave within the wider system. It was the only professional organization to elect its leaders in a full transparency, and the Bar Association provided a space for political activism, one in which political issues could be expressed. Over the past 10 years, the bâtonniers, heads of a bar association in French, had largely been aligned with the opposition. But the Bar Association governing body had always been politically heterogeneous and had included members of a far left, Arab nationalist, and Islamist party, namely the banned opposition party Ennahda, as well as partisans of Ben Ali's constitutional democratic rally, RCD in French initials. The most striking aspect of the 2010 bar elections was the victory of a member of Ennahda over the RCD candidates in the race for the post of a president of a tennis section of a bar association, which is, up to now, by far the most important regional branch in the country in terms of number and in the political sphere. This presentation is considering lawyers as the professional actors liable to engage in political activity by virtue of a role as advocates for the defense. This increased mobilization in defense of their professional values was not entirely separated from the social and economic situation, which had gradually worsened over the 90s. With the number of lawyers constantly increasing, the profession's representative bodies appealed to the Justice Department, Ministry of Justice, to enact reform, allowing them to control access to the bar and to restrict the activities of competing professions. The government, however, refused to accede to the demands, largely out of fear that the profession might instrumentalize its role as advocate for the defense to challenge the regime's authoritarian behavior. In so doing, they weakened that part of the profession loyal to the regime and drove many lawyers to adopt critical stance vis-à-vis the government. At the heart of much of this protest activity was a relatively small number of lawyers, all members of the opposition, who acted as hardliners among the activists. They were also a catalyst for the group's principles and values, both because of a resistance to the authoritarian regime and because of a professional identity as defenders of defendants' rights. These militant lawyers came into conflict with various repressive organizations of the state. Being victims of violence themselves and having contact with human rights NGO networks, they were able to put pressure on the profession as a whole to take a public stand. Lawyers were among the few social actors to challenge the regime during the early 2000s. But until the emergence of a widespread protest in late 2010, the collective action are largely revolved around the specific set of the problems related to the professional activity. The demonstrations of 2010 to 2011 were driven neither by lawyers nor by any other particular group of dissidents, but by placing themselves at the head of some demonstration, they help encourage and sustain the wave of popular protest. This endowed them with a degree of political legitimacy that has allowed the bar to increase its professional power in the post-Ben Ali era. After this introduction, I'll move to the first part. I focused here on the role of Tunisian lawyers in the protest movement as a catalyst of the uprising. Ben Ali's regime was toppled by the combination of popular uprising that spread to the middle classes and even the upper classes, and a police revolution led by some elements of a former ruling oligarchy. Although it lacked any clear leaders, the uprising that spread outwards from the small town of Sidi Bouzid was able to acquire political momentum and transform itself into a national protest. This lack of leadership was compensated for by the use of new communication technologies and round-the-clock coverage by Al Jazeera, which helped amplify the initial protest. The lawyers then are more seen as a catalyst rather than prime movers in the process. The first lawyers to engage in the uprising did so independently of the professional representative bodies. Militant lawyers working in minor county counts in regions affected by the riots publicly harangued the fellow lawyers, inciting them to leave the courts of justice and show their solidarity with the demonstrators. It is easy to identify the precise act that sparked off the protest and so led to Ben Ali's downfall. On December 17, 2010, a street vendor named Tarek Mohamed Bouazizi from the small town of Sidi Bouzid in a poor and largely rural western Tunisia set fire to himself. The same day, merchants and scores of young people organized a sit-in in front of the governor's mansion. This was broken up violently by the police. The first collective action by lawyers occurred a day later, on December 18th, a sit-in organized in front of Sidi Bouzid County Court. On December 24th, as the protests were beginning to spread throughout the central part of the country, 30 of the town's 90 lawyers marched in the ropes from the courts of justice through the street of Sidi Bouzid. This established a pattern. Sit-ins in Sidi Bouzid, Kasserine and Medellin turned into demonstrations, attracting members of a wider public. The slogans sent by the marching lawyers were political in nature. They denounced the regime and the predatory behavior of the Ben Ali's family-in-law. As a wave of dissidents spread across the country, lawyers were caught up in the protests in a similar ways. Much at the same time happened in Tunis. A sit-in of 200 lawyers, red ribbons pinned to their chest, was held in the morning of December 28th in Tunis. Later that day, two lawyers close to the far left, Choukri Belaid and Abdelraouf Ayadi, were arrested for a few hours. In response to this violent crackdown by the police, the bâtonnier, Abdelrazak El-Kilani, and other members of the councils of the Bar Association, who had particularly cautious, released a statement expressing the support for the demands of inhabitants of Sidi Bouzid. The council statement also denounced the abduction and arrest of Abderraouf Fayyadi and Shukri Belaid and demanded the immediate release. In protest against the security forces' violent response to the protest, the bar ruling body called for a day of solidarity with the inhabitants of Sidi Bouzid. All Tunisian members of the bar would wear a red ribbon in county courts on December 31st, 2010. The regime's response was to deploy law enforcement officers, both within and without the courts, to prevent lawyers from entering the courts and to stop them from wearing a red ribbon. Lawyers who refused to obey were assaulted and had their robes torn. This eruption of violence into the courts themselves led the Council of the Bar Association to speak out in support of the lawyers caught up in these events. They denounced the police action as an act of savage aggression and called for a general strike on January 6, 2011. However, it was not so much a strike as a wider dynamic of protest that galvanized the Council of the Bar Association. This resulted from a directive issued by the ruling committee of General Tunisian Workers' Union, which, though historically siding with the Ben Ali's regime, could feel the winds of change. The brutal crackdown on protesters in Tala, and especially in Kasserine, on January 8th and 9th, gave them wider social and geographical support and momentum. The uprising spread to other Tunisian towns and cities, including the capital, and also to the middle classes who were participating in protests that had begun in working class neighborhoods. Instead of simply tagging along with the rioters, the spokesperson of the Bar Association realized that they needed to be at the heart of a protest. Under pressure from its rank and file, the Workers' Union national leadership decided on January 11th to allow its regional branches to organize general strikes across the country. This opened the door to the Bar Association, which issued a call for a lawyer general strike across all courts on Friday, January 14th, as a sign of solidarity with victims of a repression and in support of the protesters' claims. On the morning of January 14th, hundreds of lawyers joined the other demonstrators on Avenue Bourguiba. The lawyers, pushed by the movement hardliners, formed a ring around the Ministry of Interior, while mass ranks of protesters, drawn from all social classes, were shouting in French, "Ben Ali dégage, Ben Ali get out." By early evening, Ben Ali had fled to Saudi Arabia and the regime had fallen. Spokesperson of the Bar Association, especially the bâtonnier Abderrazak El-Kilani, suddenly found themselves to be the major players on the political scene. The stance taken by lawyers during the protest allowed them to play a major political role under the transitional government, while considerably enhancing the professional power. This is going to be the subject of my second point. As soon as the transitional government was put in place, the lawyers' representative bodies began to get involved in newly born political environment. They adopt a critical stance towards Mohamed Ranoushi's transitional government, suggesting that he was too close to the former oligarchic regime. The bar's representative bodies also expressed their support for the demonstrators, who came from the central part of the country in late January and set up camp in Qasba Square under right the nose of a prime minister, demanding the resignation of transitional government. Still riding the wave of its revolutionary legitimacy, the Council of the Bar Association helped establish, on February 11th, the National Council for the Preservation of Revolution. This coalition of 28 distinct political parties, associations, and professional organizations brought together such diverse actors as Workers' Union, the Islamists of Ennahda, various far-left groups and associations, in favor for the defense of human rights. In spite of our internal division, all these different organizations collectively called for a clearing out of a state organization and the establishment of a constitutional assembly. A second sit-in took place in Qasba Square from February 18th, offering the Batonier Abdelrazak al-Kilani the opportunity to improve his image as well as to reinforce the idea of a Tunisian bar as a guardian of a revolution and spokesperson of Tunisian people. The resignation of Mohamed Ghannouchi on February 27th and the acceptance by his successor, Beji Qaid Sebsi, of the establishment of constitutional assembly appeared to be a victory for the bar's governing body. It is clear that the Batonier Kilani was able to derive a huge benefit from the collapse of the Ben Ali's regime. Indeed, he was able to transform the lawyers' mobilization into a revolutionary move, presenting it as a collective action of an anti-profession united behind one man himself. Some lawyers, however, had already begun to denounce what they described as another politicization of a profession and its representative bodies. Faced with this sign of discontent from within the bar, Abdelrazak al-Kilani gradually refocused his attention to the professional sphere before returning to the political stage in time for the election of a constitutional assembly. Having gained his new political resources, Abdelrazak Kilani set himself to the task of reaching the goal already outlined by the Council of the Bar Association under the former regime. Kilani's aim was to reorganize the profession in order to improve its status, strengthen its independence, and finally expand its jurisdiction. Parliament had in the meantime authorized the transitional president to issue decrees, and they hastened Kilani's efforts to draw up a bill reorganizing the profession. So the bill was duly passed by decree and without debate. The first article of a 2011 law radically altered the status of lawyers. They became a professional body which, quote, is an integral part of the establishment of justice and defend human rights and freedoms, unquote. However, not only did the law improve the profession's symbolic capital, but it also increased the lawyer's professional scope and power. The law redefined the sphere of professional immunity and allowed lawyers to conquer new professional territory from competing professions. The demise of the authoritarian regime also had a clear impact on the profession. As the Ancien regime was swept away, it dragged on RCD-aligned lawyers with it, depriving them of the financial resources the party had formerly provided them. They lost the monopoly of cases involving state institutions as the transitional government issued a circular authorizing managing directors of a state company to choose whatever lawyer they pleased. So, my conclusion. What can we conclude then from the lawyers' involvement with the protest that saw the end of Ben Ali's regime? What conclusion then should we draw? The profession's public activism throughout the years 2000 demonstrated the limits of Ben Ali's strategy of producing consent. The regime's attempt to coerce and belittle the profession gradually eroded the rule of negotiated agreement that Béatrice Hibou, a French scientist, social scientist, described as central to Tunisian political system. In so doing, they generated forms of resistance that helped politicize the bar. The majority of the profession was in a state of latent protest that just needed to be galvanized into action. The lawyers' participation in the protest endowed their representative bodies with a revolutionary legitimacy that they were able to maximize after the collapse of a regime. And thank you very much. Oh, you are still here. Good.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Today I'd like to step back and offer a perspective on the regime's treatment of dissent in the years preceding Mubarak's ousting as a way of shedding light both on the literature on authoritarianism and also on the relationship between the regime response to labor protests in that period and the revolution. The literature on authoritarianism often conceptualizes regime response to protests in terms of repression, co-optation, or a mixture of the two. But what happens when this menu of options is not employed and instead protests are treated as trivial and therefore warranting no response or treatment of any sort? I'd like to suggest that this type of non-response or indifference should not be simply equated with the absence of repression. In some cases, disengagement or indifference entails much more than a decision not to use violence. Today, I want to use the case of regime response to labor protests in Egypt in the 5 years preceding Mubarak's ousting to illustrate this type of disengagement or indifference. I would also like to show that this disengagement had important long-term consequences for the nature of subsequent labor mobilization, but also for the revolution. I will conclude by offering some theoretical implications of this analysis for the theoretical literature on authoritarianism. Now, turning to the broad pattern of regime response to workers' protests in the 2006 to 2011 period, we see that in some cases, well, first, by the mid-2000s, it was clear that the regime had eschewed the use of force when dealing with labor protests. In some cases, especially with protests and strikes in the city of Mahalla and other industrial cities, the regime did employ the normal array of repression and co-optation in dealing with these types of protests. In fact, these protests seem to be, especially the ones in Mahalla, seem to be addressed in one way or another. They seem to warrant some sort of response or treatment, possibly because of the influence of this group and its history of mobilization. In fact, in December 2006, workers were promised, after a big strike in Mahalla, workers were promised a great deal and given substantial concessions. In April 2008, in anticipation of the announced general strike, well, first the announced strike of the Mahalla workers and then the call for a general strike, Mahalla workers came under considerable pressures from the regime, and some of them were forced to sign a statement calling off the strike. Later, labor activists argue that there was a systematic campaign aimed at undermining the Mahalla movement by punishing key leaders and transferring some of them to menial jobs. My interest here is not to explain variation in regime response to protests, only to highlight that in many other cases, the regime seemed to be indifferent to labor protests, especially when they were held, or ironically, even when they were held right in the middle of decision-making in downtown Cairo. So beyond the fact that some protests elicited the normal response of repression and co-optation, I want to suggest that a great deal of indifference characterized the way in which the regime handled or viewed labor protests in the 2006 to 2011 period, even, as I said, when they were held in downtown Cairo. I use the term indifference here to suggest that there was something more than just a decision not to use force, and something beyond the normal policing of protests. In fact, one can see a great deal of detachment between the way in which regime officials and the involvement of security forces tasked with policing any protests. While security forces sometimes quite positively got involved by acting as intermediaries between regime officials and protesters, most regime officials viewed protests and sit-ins mainly as a form of inconvenience, or as an inconvenience rather than a challenge of any sort. The main caveat here, of course, is that as long as labor protests were narrowly focused on economic demands, they seem to elicit this sort of indifferent response. Now, what do I mean by indifference? I want to unpack that term a little bit by offering a couple of ways in which this indifference was manifested. One, regime officials seemed uninterested or indifferent to the site of protest. The year 2007 was the first year to witness workers' protests on the street in downtown Cairo. mainly in front of various government agencies or buildings. The trend took off quite quickly after that, reaching a peak in 2010 when the sidewalk of Parliament became a commonplace for holding these protests. By May 2010, there were protests on the sidewalk of Parliament for about 3 months consecutively. As a result, it became commonplace for workers to hold protests in front of government buildings in downtown Cairo. Labor activists were conscious of the potential for this strategy to ensure that their voices are better heard, but this did not always work. Notably, major workers' protests had taken place in factories, as in the case of Mahalla in 2006, but the regime did not seem more concerned about workers' protests taking place on the street than it had with workers' protests taking place inside factories or other industrial towns. So even though these different forms of protest, i.e. in factories versus on the street, were met with minimal violence, I will suggest later that the indifference to the site of protest had important consequences. Of course, there were limits to the regime's tolerance of where protests would be held. Security forces made sure that protesters did not go outside certain parameters by cordoning the areas around which the protests could take place. So it would have been fine for real estate tax collectors to occupy the immediate vicinity of the Council of Ministers building, but not fine for them to march onto Tahrir Square. But these boundaries were continually negotiated. The second, so the main consequence from this was the normalization, as I said, of protests in front of Parliament and major government buildings. The second aspect of indifference I want to highlight is indifference in the sense of this ignore until forced to accommodate approach. It seemed that most regime officials had a I do not want to be bothered attitude with regards to labor protests. When real estate tax collectors held a sit-in in front of the Council of Ministers building in 2007, for example, Prime Minister Nazif simply left and went to his other office in the Smart Village on the outskirts of Cairo. A few days into the same sit-in, former Minister of Finance, Boutros Ghali, said, quote, I do not want to be arm-twisted by succumbing to popular pressure. If the protesters threatened to remain on the street until their demands were resolved, he said he would tell them to, quote, stay on the street. In fact, on several other occasions, labor activists reported that officials did not bother to speak with them at all. In some cases, protesters managed to force officials to speak with them. Notably, the real estate tax collectors ironically ended up negotiating with Ghali by the end of their strike and winning, as we heard yesterday, above 300% raise by the end of the strike. While the ignore until forced to accommodate approach was quite frustrating for protesters, the passive nature of the regime's response opened the possibility for holding extended sit-ins on the street. As protesters realized that perhaps by staying longer on the street, they would cause more inconvenience and perhaps get their demands heard. A group of Minister of Justice employees, for instance, held a sit-in in front of the Minister of Justice for almost 30 consecutive days in the summer of 2008. Thousands of real estate tax collectors camped outside of the Council of Ministers building on Hussein Hegazi Street for almost 11 consecutive days in December 2007. It was not until day 3 or 4 that the regime officials signaled their willingness to speak to a group representative. In many cases, it appeared that labor protests caused more noise to regime officials than anything else. This picture is quite telling. This is of information center employees. The placard held here by the woman says, we are sitting in, we are sitting in, we are sitting in, until you care, until you listen, until you do justice. This exemplifies this type of kind of frustration with the indifference that I'm trying to illustrate. This indifference, I argue, sets stage for 4 important dynamics. 1, extensive media coverage of labor protests during this period. Arguably more media coverage than if these events had taken place inside offices or factories. This was quite important as groups could read and watch the experience of other groups on TV or in newspapers. In discussions with various tax collectors, they told me that they joined their colleagues and they watched the first initial days of the strike on TV and joined their colleagues after that. The second dynamic that emerged from this is the possibility of physical interaction between various groups of workers. So this probably did not translate into more coordination, but it probably did increase communication, or at the very least awareness that other groups had similar grievances. There was also a greater possibility for physical interaction between labor activists and political activists. Some political activists visited the site of the real estate tax collector strike. Several members of the tax collectors group explained that some of Kifaya members went up to the protesters and even kissed their hands to congratulate them on what was going on. The third dynamic is the public nature of those protests, namely the fact that they were happening on the street, made it possible for the general public to witness contentious politics more closely. This meant that workers' protests workers were not only addressing the regime in these protests, they were also appealing to their fellow Egyptian citizens. This meant that workers' protests became occasions for various performances. I will show some images of these performances in a few minutes. These protests also became a family kind of affair. It became commonplace for workers to bring their wives, their kids, and their husbands to engage in the extended sit-in. So again, amplifying the scope of the involvement of the general public in these forms of protest. The fourth dynamic I want to highlight is the visibility and extensive media coverage set the stage for the possibility of learning across groups. In fact, many groups cited the experience of the real estate tax collectors when asked why they had decided to camp out in front of major government buildings. The environment thus became conducive for the transfer of tactics and experiences. At this point, it is important to note that the regime did, in some cases, deploy its arsenal of repression and co-optation even when dealing with this type of street politics by workers. On a couple of occasions, security forces did employ force to disperse protests in front of parliament or other major government buildings. But these occasions were few and far between, and they took place long after protesting in those locations had become routine. Now, this begs the question, before going on to what this all means, some images of public performances that I'm talking about. This is an image of a particular group that decided that they want to symbolize the way in which the regime's policies toward workers had kind of are equivalent to like sort of a death sentence. So this is a stage of a funeral service to symbolize what that meant for them. And this is another image of protesters kind of defying all sorts of social norms and taking off their shirts in the middle of downtown Cairo in front of a major government building. And not only that, but also writing slogans on their bellies, incriminating the government. And this is another one of the illustrations of how workers use this type of activism to perform publicly. Another illustration of death. This particular one is from Information Center employees in 2010, with saying like, this is how I look like after 9 years of working in this municipal information centers. This is another example of workers wearing kind of this, what you would wear before you would be buried, to symbolize workers' death. This is a manifestation of kids becoming prominently involved in the act of protesting. So what does this all mean? Does this mean mismanaging dissent? From the regime's and why this indifference, after all? From the regime's perspective, these general orientations toward labor protests were perhaps motivated by a safety valve approach. The idea that we should, people should be given some space to air their grievances, but the safety valve explanation is premised on the assumption that allowing some space to air grievances might possibly prevent escalation or radicalization. It is not clear, however, that this is what happened, as protesters often escalated their protest strategy or increased the number of participants. It is true that protests did not really become more radical in terms of demands, but this sustained moderate threat of daily protests did persist. In addition, the apparent indifference of government officials to these protests further enraged protesters. the fact that regime officials adopted this "I do not want to be bothered" attitude made it clear to a great number of aggrieved workers that their demands were not taken seriously, and that they were not themselves taken seriously as citizens or even as human beings. Rather than absorb then people's frustration, the regime appeared to fuel even more outrage. In a sense, the regime's indifference produced more outrage than had existed at the outset. So if people had simply economic grievances at the beginning, they ended up having deep distrust and a sense of injustice toward the government more generally by the end of the strike. Another explanation that is sometimes used is perhaps the regime wanted to paint a more pluralistic image of Egyptian politics. Again, this is perhaps the case, I'm not sure, but this justification was used by some prominent officials, including Ahmed Izz on some interviews regarding labor protests. There's another explanation. Perhaps one could argue that the regime was somewhat trapped. It could not really use force because of the negative repercussions, both domestically and internationally, and did not have the financial means to appease everyone. So it was essentially forced to do nothing. This might mean that the regime had become a bit overwhelmed by social discontent, but that had managed to do enough just by disconnecting political discontent for social discontent, the idea of compartmentalizing dissent. As long as those two camps are separate, political and economic forms of discontent, it's okay. But is this really enough? I would argue that there was a certain degree of arrogance can be detected in the way in which the regime dealt with labor protests. There seemed to be an assumption that nothing could possibly result from these forms of protests, and that there is no harm in letting people express themselves in this way. The response also belied a very narrow conception of what constitutes political threat. It seemed that the content of the protest, i.e. whether it was about economic demands, seemed to take precedence over the form of dissent. This means that the only thing that seemed to matter was whether protests articulated a broad political agenda, not whether they had become more confrontational or had taken place in strategic locations. My analysis thus suggests that there is something beyond the decision not to use violence that is important about how the regime responds to protest. Now, how is any of this relevant to the January 25th revolution? There are three mechanisms, I argue, are important, but I conceptualize this impact as sort of a long-term impact. At the most basic level, regime officials did not take workers' protests seriously, which led to some of the dynamics I laid out above. I don't want to suggest that workers' mobilization itself was threatening enough to bring down the regime, but I do want to say that the regime underestimated the tool of street politics more generally, especially when it was used to achieve strictly economic gains. This tendency to underestimate and trivialize actions of various opposition actors came up on more than one occasion. A couple of examples have to do with the shadow government in 2010 when people were told, this is just, you can play, that's fine. I can give more examples in Q&A. The second thing is the indifference to labor protests on the part of the regime allowed for an emergence of an environment conducive to learning across different groups, like I outlined above. And then third, the normalization of street politics contributed to bringing down the fear barrier in the years preceding Mubarak's ousting. It would be naive to think that this fear barrier was broken for the first time on January 25th. And just to conclude, I would say there are three implications for the theoretical literature on authoritarianism. My analysis offers evidence that the regime might have mismanaged labor dissent. And two, on an analytical level, I think we should take this category of indifference seriously as a type or dimension of regime response that is not captured by the regular co-optation, repression type categories. And third, learning is not simply the purview of regimes. Social actors are capable of it too. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Slogans are well studied as poetry. And in fact, some of the categories of literary analysis, especially genre and prosody, are absolutely essential for understanding them as texts. But slogans are not texts whose meanings can be reduced to a purely semantic level. Most often they are part of performances. They are embodied actions taking place in particular situations with particular effects. This opens up connections for thinking about aesthetics and politics together. Aesthetics and things like poetry not as mere ornament or sideshow or mirror of politics, but rather as part and parcel of the practice of politics. The phenomenon of slogans represents an intersection between political activism and poetic performance, which I hope to show will show also the relevance of cultural analysis to thinking about revolution. Like other slogans, the words "the people want" have been sung and resung countless times in marches, assemblies, and street fights, painted onto temporary and permanent forms of signage, graffitied onto walls, recorded and rebroadcast in print and televised media, and reposted onto thousands of electronic media platforms. There are many ways we could think about these slogans. I have been engaged in studying them as literature, and I'll just to give you a couple examples of what that sort of analysis produces. First of all, thinking of slogans in terms of genre, one can't help but be struck by the fact that almost all the slogans of the Egyptian revolution belong to two genres from classical poetry, hamasa and hajat, or insult poetry. And then, in fact, the more you look into slogans as hajat poetry, the more you begin to discover that insult is actually quite important to making revolution. Another aspect that comes out very quickly is the issue of affect. Yesterday, in one of the panels on media, we talked, or it came up a little bit, the issue of affect came up, and particularly those people who never got off their couches or were stuck to their computer screens. One of the striking things about people who participated in the revolution throughout has been, in their own accounts, the feeling of what it feels like to be part of a large group of people doing this. And poetry seems to have been a central part of that, the production of that feeling, and that feeling seems to have actually been quite important to this, to maintaining and amplifying the revolution itself. In my paper today, my focus will be on something slightly different, which is how these slogan poems entered into the contentious performances of Egyptian activists. My paper will have roughly 3 parts. The first will just be to talk about how poetry or slogans are composed. I'll be arguing that it is not random, but actually follows a set pattern. The second part of my paper looks at the particular slogan, "the people want," and the third, the people want to topple the regime, and the third part of my paper looks more closely at that slogan. So the first point I'd like to emphasize about slogans in general is that they are produced in the context of protest repertoires. The term repertoire is taken from Charles Tilley's writings on English social movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. For Tilley, what came to be known as social movements combined 3 elements. 1, an organized and sustained claim-making on target authorities. 2, a repertoire of performances, including associations, public meetings, media statements, and street marches. And 3, public representations of the cause's worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. While all these aspects resonate strongly with the Egyptian revolution, it is his stress on repertoire that is most illuminating for thinking of slogans. For Tilley, contentious gatherings, and we've heard Dina already employing some of the same vocabulary and the idea of performance, so this is, we're sort of overlapping in great ways, I think. For Tilley, contentious gatherings are things like public assemblies, demonstrations, marches, and strikes, and they are the primary actions that form a social movement. With each action, activists attempt to build upon and learn from the successes and failures of previous actions. Tilley calls this process of learning, revising, and improvising a repertoire, and stresses that this repertoire plays a role in standardizing and limiting the nature of contentious performance. In thinking of contentious performance as repertoire, it is useful to recall the resonance of repertory in theater. Typically, repertory describes theater which remounts works that are already known and tried. A repertoire is, in essence, a catalog or playbook of works that have been previously produced to some degree of success. Asif Bayat, Joel Bainan, Marie Debouk, and Dina Bishara have all been describing the repertoires of political protest in the late Mubarak years, the staging of strikes, marches, assemblies that characterized the decade leading up to the revolution. But we could also extend this logic of repertoire to the production and performance of slogans in Egypt for the same period. Let me sketch a little bit how this works. Within activist groups, there are usually individuals who are known for their wit and humor. Some of them in Egypt, in fact, are nicknamed isqat, the poet. Whether or not they really are a poet is another thing, but the important thing is that people believe it. As part of the preparation for an event, these composers are asked to compile a list of slogans that the group will try. The process is usually informal, and it is common for multiple lists to be created by many hands. Some slogans are painted onto banners and signs. Those who compose slogans always draw on a wealth of discourse that is already known. Famous lines of poetry or song, recent or timeless words of a public figure, slogans from previous actions, popular sayings with some or no modification. Originality counts, but only if presented in the form of familiarity. Now, this may be old news to social scientists, but thinking of this as a literary problem, this is actually quite striking because it goes against the norms of modernist aesthetics. Within each group, there is usually an activist or a set of individuals known for their loud voices, stamina, and courage. These individuals are given the task of leading the chants, sustaining them in difficult times, and knowing when to change course and to adapt. The form is either call and response or lead and follow. As one person's voice wavers, another steps forward to take up the slack. Sometimes the leader will use a script of specially coined slogans, but always the main slogans will be based on ones already used successfully in a previous action. Though there is wide lexical divergence in the slogans, in terms of genre, form, and sound, there is little variation. The rhythms and meter are few in number and already known to those who participate. Whether they know it consciously is another thing, but the patterns are familiar, at least. A slogan cannot become part of repertoire within the space of a single performance. Rather, a slogan becomes powerful through a process of repetition and trial, and this usually takes days, if not weeks, or much longer. During an action, activists listen to see how slogans work and whether they appear to have any resonance or effect. Do they get the police mad? Do they get people to join the action or not? And afterwards, activists meet to discuss the event, and they consider the effect of one-day slogans as they prepare for the next. Throughout the process, activists are recording the action and preparing to share details of the event with others, including favorite slogans. If you know activists, they love to take credit for wonderful slogans. And of course, the new media has helped. It provides new platforms for sharing this, but this has always been the case. Activists are always sharing slogans. And then allied groups, of course, are sharing their experiences with one another and their slogans with one another. Through this feedback loop, slogans are disseminated and adapted. Those slogans thought to work well become part of the repertoire of the next protest. Those that do not are either revised or saved to another day or discarded. And just as the model of repertoire would suggest, of the hundreds of slogans performed during the revolution, only a fraction ever became part of a lasting part of the repertoire. Okay, and now to the slogan, Sha'ab urid isqat nizam. When Egyptians first began to chant this on the evening of January 25th, there was very little that was new about the slogan, and this seems to have been part of its power. Egyptians knew that Tunisians had been chanting it for weeks, sometimes with subtle variations. And part of this familiarity, of course, was due to media coverage, but the dissemination also came about from activist networks across borders. Human rights activists and internet activists across the Arab world had long focused their attention on the Ben Ali regime, and before Ben Ali's rule began to crack, these networks were well established and in daily contact with Tunis. Activists in Cairo described lending logistical support to Tunisians from the early days of the revolt there. When Tunisian authorities began to shut down websites, Egyptian activists opened up mirror sites and reposted videos and commentary onto social media outlets. From the earliest days, it was largely Egyptian-sourced Twitter feeds with hashtags Bouazizi and Sidi Bouzid that rebroadcast links to the Tunisian demonstration and to the slogans of the Tunisian demonstrations. Thus, as the slogans of the revolution in Tunisia began to proliferate and amplify there, much of the action was also coming from supporters in Egypt. Many of these same Egyptian activists were busy preparing for January 25th. Why they took up this slogan, but not other Tunisian slogans, demands some comment. First, the register of the slogan tells us something key. Unlike many of the other slogans from the Tunisian uprising, this one was not in French, nor in the Tunisian colloquial. The language is peculiar, in fact, because it straddles colloquial and standard media Arabics. The register also articulates a shared language that connects back to Tunis and forward to other Arab countries. And like the Tunisians before them, when Egyptians began to chant this slogan, they knew that they were not only singing to themselves or their neighbors, but they were self-consciously performing revolution for the entire Arab world. As some Egyptians told me, what was most striking about this slogan, the first time they heard it, was that it contained no metaphor. Now that is, I think, something we should contest. But it is an interesting point to think through it regardless. The simple act, I'm paraphrasing these activists, the simple act of declaring what one wanted in blunt language was something radically new. As one confided, in a political culture dominated by half-truths and innuendo, the directness of this particular speech, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, needs to be seen as a form of estrangement poetics. But the observation most often made about this particular slogan is that it cites the opening lines of a very famous composition by the Tunisian poet Abu al-Qasim al-Shabi, إذا الشعب يوم أراد الحياة فلا بد أن يستجيب القدر. Shabi's poem, The Will to Live, أرادت الحياة, is more than famous. It is a poem whose opening lines any high school student in the Arab world would know by heart, and many of my students now have to know it by heart too. The opening stanza goes like this, and I don't have time to read it, but if you look at the English, I've tried to reproduce the heavy neoclassical tone in my translation, and I'll say more about that in a second. Shabi was a gifted poet from the Tunisian hinterlands who died relatively unknown in 1934 at the age of 25. Few of his poems were published in his native land during his life, and his main interlocutors were, in fact, in Egypt. It was through these friendships that a few of his later poems, like this one, were published in the Egyptian journal Apollo. Shabi was, for the most part, interested in existential themes like life, love, and loss, and their connections to natural landscapes, forests, seas, and mountains. No one would ever mistake his poetry for platform or political rhetoric. On the contrary, despite its reference to the people, his poem, The Will to Live, is cluttered with figures of primal elements, wind, water, ice, and flora, and it narrates the journey of a seed struggling to live through a cycle of seasons. In fact, when read in the context of Shabi's work, it becomes clear that what the poet meant by the people was something very different from how it's being read today. The term "the people" recurs in a number of poems from Shabi's that Shabi composed in the very last months of his life when he knew he was going to die. But it always is twinned with the word life, as it is in this poem. In the context, and it is always appearing in a context of an eternal battle between life and death, spring and winter, light and darkness. The people in Shabi's diwan is not a figure of mass politics, but rather that of the isolated creative genius, the romantic self-making artist whose voice makes possible the folk. When Tunisians took up Shabi's poem in late 2010, it had already been around for almost 80 years, though for the most part consigned to anthologies and textbooks. Even as this poem is one of the best known of the entire modern period, it is or was stilted in a number of ways. On the one hand, it's composed in a monorhymed classical meter, mutaqarab, that was almost as anachronistic in 1932 as it is in 2011. On the other hand, its romantic themes were equally detached from the political agendas of the period of national liberation and the period of post-independence stagnation. Until last year, the poem had little place in political repertoires, even those where platform poetry was often performed. As you know, poetry is not divorced from political events in the Arab world, on the contrary. But this poem is not part of that, generally, with one exception. And how this poem became available for revolutionary use in 2010 demands some explanation. Part of the story lies in the effort by Tunisian critics and academics to create an Arabophone literary canon during the period of decolonization. 2 decades after his death, Chabi was reconstrued as the national poet of Tunisia by a generation of nationalists seeking to Arabize the intellectual institutions of the country. His poems became part of the national curriculum, and until this day, every student in Tunisia, I'm told, is compelled to memorize these lines in the yearly Mahfoudat examinations. But perhaps the crucial moment in the story comes in 1987, when Ben Ali came to power in a coup d'etat. To underscore his difference from Habib Bourguiba, the man he had overthrown, Ben Ali replaced the old national anthem with a new one. The old one actually had references to El Habib, and Ben Ali quickly got rid of that anthem. The lyrics to the new song, entitled Hamat al-Hama, were composed by Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i. In the principal stanza of the song, the stanza repeated at state functions and sports events, were inserted the first 2 lines of Chabi's poem. Again, I've tried to reproduce the clunkiness of the Arabic in my translation, so you can get a sense of how, at least, get a sense of what it sounds like in the Arabic. Here, then, we can begin to understand why Chabi's poem was so available to Tunisians before and during the revolution. It was not, as some have claimed, because Tunisians have a deep love for an old poem. Rather, I think it's because of the state policies that Tunisians could not help but know Chabi's poems, or this poem in particular. And the words were not necessarily associated primarily with the poem itself, but rather with the state rituals of the Ben Ali regime. And in the context of their deployment in political spectacle, something else becomes quite clear: the taunting challenge that was there all along in the poem. Chabi did not write that the people do want to live. He posed a conditional: if the people want to live. And so during the Tunisian Revolution, the same national anthem that Ben Ali imposed on the country was sung often by protesters. These events and these performances were quite literally demonstrations of a counter-public, as revolutionaries repossessed the public rituals, the public words, and the public spaces of the Tunisian state in order to contest the patriotism of the Ben Ali regime. And so when Tunisians began to state that the people want, they were self-consciously taking the conditional voice that appears in Chabi's poem and in the national anthem and transforming it into a declarative. If Chabi's florid metaphors had been tarnished by their association with state discourse, the revolutions dusted off 2 terms: the people and want, and threw them back in a blunt manner whose musical phrasing was not that of the national anthem. And this is the last point I want to make about this particular slogan as poetry, namely that its sound patterns were also borrowed from the repertory of Arab protest music. Unlike most of the other key slogans of the revolution, isqat urid has no rhyme, no assonance, and no consonants. However, it does have a stress pattern, which, while not a classical meter, is recognizable as the most popular music pattern of slogans performed at demonstrations across the Arab world. And I'm talking about the sound pattern associated with the chant or slogan, Beruh bedem naftik ya fulan. Earlier in Tunis, this sound pattern was initially used in other slogans, including a very popular bilingual chant, Dégage, dégage, dégage ya khomaj. And in Cairo on January 25th, protesters had been singing Beruh bedem naftik ya Masr throughout much of the day. When they began to sing isqat urid that evening, they were doing so to a tune that they had already been singing for hours, a tune they picked up from a much older protest repertoire. So to conclude, the analysis of repertoire can explain the dissemination of slogans and their persistence, but it says little about their content. And surprisingly, the world has accepted this particular slogan as if its significance were self-evident, even though it is in fact quite ambiguous. From one perspective, the stated desire of wanting to topple the regime looks quite specific and tangible. From another, it looks vague and general. From one perspective, it looks as if the revolution succeeded in forcing its demands in a mere 18 days. From another, it is equally clear that the revolution has not yet begun. As the narrative of revolution has broadened and complicated in the last year, the slogan "the people want" has continued to occupy a central position, and the ambiguities have only intensified. These words are not just chanted in demonstrations, but painted all over the walls, a constant reminder that the struggle persists and complicates. Days after Mubarak resigned last year, it became the phrase, "The people want to honor the martyrs of the revolution." In March, it became, "The people want to topple military rule." In August, when Mubarak was put on trial, it became, "The people want to sentence the president to death." In October, when Coptic Christians protested sectarian violence and official discrimination, the chant in the street was, "The people want to topple the general." When Egyptian state television urged viewers to attack Coptic demonstrators, revolutionaries repackaged the old slogan again, now as, "The people want to purify the Ministry of Information." And so it goes. The slogan has served as the discursive scaffolding for hanging every new demand, even though, if taken in sum, these demands would seem incoherent and at times contradictory. This history of slogan repertoire highlights the fact that while repetition is the strength of performance, it also marks a weakness. There's no doubt that the slogan is now tired, but as the revolution and counter-revolutions have evolved, the slogan has refused to disappear. As Ernesto Laclau reminds us, what is at stake in the representation of the people is nothing less than hegemony. What he also reminds us is that the most powerful metaphor of the revolutionary was this figure of the collective singular, the people. From the beginning, revolutionaries have understood that their success depends on their ability to portray themselves as the sole representative of Egyptian society and their ability to control the use of this metaphor. But by now, every other political actor understands this. There is no political claim that is not made in some image of a collective singular. Even counter-revolutionaries, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, business elites, Salafis, and the army, grasp this and play by these rules. The logic of repertoire says nothing about the coherence or truthfulness of claims. It respects only success. Given the success of popular claim-making, no party to the revolution can afford not to speak in the name of the people. And it's unlikely that the slogan will disappear anytime soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all our panelists for, I think, three very, very interesting and engaging talks. And so now, and also for their self-discipline and sticking pretty much to their time limits, and which has allowed us some time for questions and comments from the audience. There are two microphones set up in the aisles here, so please, you can address your question to a particular speaker or all the speakers, however you wish. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Abi Mershid.
I want to add my thanks for the very interesting papers, and I have a question for Professor Gobe. I was wondering if you could expand upon your conclusion and maybe go beyond the perspective of the regime, because it seems that your research has something to say about, how shall I put it? It might have something to say about the social, vocational status of the lawyers in this particular context and the emergence of maybe a class-based social political consciousness. Something to say about the experiences and practices of the legal profession in this context and how it may have shaped their political sensibilities, their political positions, their habitus, basically. Thank you.
I'm supposed to answer now?
Yes, if you would like.
I'm going to try to answer in English, but if I have a problem, I think people can translate from French to English. I hope so.
Like Spanish cows.
Okay.
Here you go.
It's a question difficult to answer. I think lawyers is an heterogeneous profession. So you have, for instance, businessmen lawyers, you have, but the main part of lawyers come from the middle classes and lower classes. So these people receive many things of the transitional government, receive many things on account of the modification of a law. With the new law, the new law permits the lawyers to erase the competing profession. And so the present the profession is now sustaining the new regime. You know, you have many lawyers in the new government, and for instance, lawyers from CPR, Congrès pour la République, and from NADA, and so you have presently a big connection between lawyers and the present political power, I think so.
Thank you also for the three of you for the excellent papers, which each in their own way get into the micro-histories of the events. So to Dina, I think this is really very important. What you're trying to do is to understand the logic of the regime, which is extremely difficult since we have absolutely no access to documents or conversations and so on. So I want to suggest another element that is consistent with your story, basically, and that's the international element. So between 1998 and 2004, when the movement really began, I have absolutely no clue what was going on. I wasn't in Egypt very much during that time. But as far as I know, the first major event which marked a break in the repertoire, and this gets to the question I want to ask Elliot too, an innovation in repertoire was at Ora Misr, where this is an asbestos making factory where they make used to make building materials out of asbestos. Now, Egypt does have a law prohibiting that, but they didn't enforce it, and decades before it was banned in the United States and Europe. So the Center for Trade Union Worker Services, in concert with European trade unions, mounted a campaign in Egypt, and in collaboration with the workers who sat in front of the factory in 10th of Ramadan City for months. Eventually, they got the Egyptian government to impose on the factory that they had to pay all the health costs of people who had been ill and who had been killed and so on. The factory owner, who was a Muslim brother, we should note, coincidentally or not so coincidentally, just shut the factory and ran away. So this is the first time that there was both a tactical innovation and a win, and it had to do with international pressure being mobilized on the regime. So that suggests that part of what the regime was afraid of is that when Nazif came to power, and he's going to accelerate the neoliberal sell-off of the public sector, he has to have the confidence of the international financial institutions and investors and so on, and workers dying of lung cancer because they're making materials with asbestos is not cool. So the regime just has to, okay, pay them, and the guy won't pay. So there are a few other points like that. For example, trying to shut down the Center for Trade Union Worker Services in 2007, and then again a big campaign of international pressure, and a year later they not only open it up, but the Minister of Manpower and Migration comes to the celebration reopening it. So I see we're not so bad, actually. So there are these moments when the regime gives way to international pressure, or what it perceives as potential international pressure. So this somehow connects to my question to Elliot, which is when you use Chuck Tilley, Allah yarhamu, this is a very, I love this guy. I mean, he was one of my teachers, and really couldn't say anything bad about him. His conception of repertoire, as you said, is pretty structural. In the introduction to the book that I co-edited with Frédéric Vérel on social movements, mobilization, and contestation in the Middle East and North Africa, one of the things we try to say is that repertoire is in fact dynamic, and subaltern strata have agency in innovating in repertoire. And this is the same point I made yesterday with regard to Doug McAdams' article on tactical innovations and the pace of insurgency. So it's, I think, important to note also both the continuity, which you did brilliantly, that was terrific, but also when and how and under what circumstances is there innovation in the repertoire, and does that innovation lead to some kind of advance in the insurgent movement, which is what McAdam suggests should happen.
All right. Thank you very much. I have just 2 points to make on that. One is I completely agree. The international element plays a big role, I think, in how, at some key moments, in pressuring the regime to do something in response to labor protests. And this takes place with the real estate tax collectors when they meet with a ILO delegation and get their paperwork in. So I don't contest that point at all. I just want to make a quick clarification. In this particular paper, I'm actually primarily not interested in explaining why the regime responded in this way. I'm wanting to primarily chronicle a type of response, i.e. indifference, that is not usually accounted for in what we perceive of as a type of response in terms of repression or co-optation. So while I am trying to maybe shed some hypotheses on why the regime would respond or not respond in this particular way, I'm actually not interested in explaining it per se. Or I don't know if I can. You're right, I don't think I can get access.
Thanks for the question. I have been struck over the last year about how little scholarship there is on slogans in general. The little bit that I've been able to find is scattered in fields like sociology, where people don't engage in close readings of texts, or in folklore studies, which actually I think methodologically is the more interesting set. Crowd studies also is a really interesting, if we're thinking of slogans as performances, I found actually crowd studies, and particularly the work of Clark McPhail, to be really interesting. McPhail distinguishes between 4 elements in crowds or contentious assemblies: feet, hands, face, and mouth. Slogans belong to mouth. It's what people are saying when they're grouped together and when they're assembled. But the main distinction, he says, is feet. Is an assembly stationary or moving? And when I think of what the innovations are, for instance, on January 25th, there's all sorts of innovations. There's new things happening, okay? But one of the things that I think is really new that we haven't paid attention to is moving assemblies in Cairo. That was radically new. There were moving assemblies in factory towns and so on, but the regime for a decade had allowed, for instance, all these slogans. Many of these slogans are repetitions of things that have been said for a decade or longer in places like Cairo. But those demonstrations, either at the lawyers or the journalists' union or in front of the parliament, were always surrounded by thousands of riot police. And in fact, that was the regime's game in the early days of the revolution. What was new, and everyone talks about this, is they had never seen a march down a street. It just was, it had been 40 years since that had happened. So, so using McPhail to kind of think about this, the innovation there is on feet. That's the category means, is it moving or is it stationary? In terms of, your point is one I'm going to be thinking about, because this subject is new to me, and I'm not aware of everything, of all the dynamics. I would say that the process I'm trying to describe is one that is dynamic. But conceptualizing innovation, usually in poetics, is seen as a break. What I'm trying to think of here is innovation as recombinations, and incredibly creative and dynamic recombinations. It is not the same. And in this, I've been actually using the work of performance studies, and Richard Schechner yesterday, I think Marwan was calling for a study of bodies as media, And in fact, there's an entire field and there's departments of this. It's called performance studies. And Richard Schechner, for instance, describes the process by which performances are created in theater, but also beyond. So he distinguishes between proto-performance, performance, and post-performance. These, if you look at how activists actually do their work, the model is they do workshops, they do rehearsals, they do warm-ups, they practice, practice, practice. They check in afterwards, they have post-ops, and but it's understanding innovation as recombination, although there are some things that are new. For instance, the one thing I've been able to say about January 25th is the march seems to be new. But that, by the way, had already been happening in factory towns and had been happening in Tunisia. So even though it's new in Cairo, it's based on an understanding that there's a repertoire elsewhere, and suddenly it works.
Okay. Since we have quite a few people who would like to ask questions and not a lot of time left, maybe we can regroup the questions and then allow our speakers to respond to them. So please, but if you could keep your questions short to the point. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Monsieur Gobe, I wonder if, given that you are living in Morocco, I know you're studying Tunis, but could you draw any comparisons with what you talked about the Tunisian legal lawyers and what is happening in Morocco? It seems there are some minor differences with the king either being a half step behind or a half step ahead in legal reform, particularly recent demonstrations with 475 and you know, the honor of family. But if you could make any comments on that, I'd appreciate it, if you have any.
Okay. If you can just keep that one in mind. Yes, please.
Yep. Hi, my name is Jordan Daniels. I'm a senior studying international politics, and I wanted to address my question specifically to our last speaker. I recently read Asif Bayat's book, Life as Politics, for a class, and it was my first introduction to social non-movements, and I find that field particularly fascinating, and I thought that your talk had a lot of relevancy to that, and I just wanted to know if you could comment on how you think sort of the everyday practices, like you were talking about chants at soccer games, or how that might unify the Arab world in some way, and how may or may not have facilitated the use of slogans and phrases, not just in Tunisia, but in Egypt and in other countries as well.
Great. Thank you, all three, for wonderful papers. My name's Samar Shahata. I teach here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. I just want to push Dina a little bit on this, really interesting presentation with this idea of indifference, which I'm a bit kind of uncomfortable with because it suggests apathy. And we know that the regime was very concerned, but maybe concerned in a different way than the protests that occurred in Cairo and other places. I mean, in one instance, and I think Joey can correct me if I get the date wrong, after one major protest in Mahalla, the Prime Minister went to Mahalla immediately, along with the Minister of Health, along with the Minister of Finance, along with the Minister of Labor, and so on. So I agree with much of what you said, but I'm just wondering if we can kind of think a little bit more about how we can think about this conceptually. Because indifference, I think, I'm not fully comfortable with that.
So we'll take one final question.
Hi, my name's Gabriel. I'm a sophomore studying Arabic. So my question is for Professor Kola. I guess I want to hear you talk a little bit more about how slogans can be changed so that they aren't so promiscuous, I guess, in that their advantage is that they can be repeated and that they're easily repeated and recoined in many different ways. But you also mentioned that their disadvantage is that then they can be kind of co-opted by maybe opposition movements, or you can use the same phrase, changing one word, and it suddenly becomes something that supports the exact opposite. So is there a way does it need to be done at the beginning of the movement when you're coining the phrase initially, the slogan initially, or is there a way midway through the movement that you can alter it so that it is kind of an exclusive, like copyrighted sort of thing, or does that just take away from its power throughout the process? Thank you.
Would you like to just answer in order, but it would have to be quite brief, I'm afraid. Yeah, Eric first. Yeah.
It will be brief. In fact, I'm new in Morocco, so I've just arrived and I can't answer your question. I'm supposed to study transitional, in the future, in the next 2 years, transitional justice in comparative way in Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. I think so. So I can't answer about, for instance, the actors of reform of Mudawana, the family law or something like that. So I'm so sorry, maybe in the future after 2 years, but not now.
You'll have to come back.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Samer. I think what I maybe want to clarify is that I think there are ways in which the regime was very attentive. I think Mahalla stands out as partly an exception to the way in which I talk about indifference. On almost every single occasion, Mahalla protests did elicit a response of one form, one way, shape, or form that was actually taken pretty seriously by the regime. What I tried to do today is, I think the term indifference does characterize other ways in which the regime handled other labor protests, especially ones that were by small groups, not like a big, heavy, kind of heavyweight like Mahalla. So people from like the Amancito factory or whatever who were in front of Parliament for, I don't know, 45 days or something like this, and were begging for some sort of response, and there was no attention whatsoever. So I think that there are variations in the way in which the regime responds to something like Mahalla and something like smaller groups protesting for the first time, or not even for the first time, like in front of Parliament. So perhaps I need to clarify that a little bit or think about it more. But yeah, thank you.
I'll try to answer quickly. First, just on a word about how do slogans maybe unify the Arab world? I would put it, how do they travel across borders, especially dialect borders? This particular slogan did that because it is in a register that that's very conducive, say, to Al Jazeera kind of that register of Arabic. Just to give a quick anecdote from last January at the Egyptian embassy, as people were singing Sha'b yurid isqat nizam over and over again and handing out candy, I was there for a wonderful conversation where somebody said, look, مش احنا مصريين، احنا ما بنقولش يريد أبدا، احنا بنقول عايز. And so aren't we Egyptian? We don't ever say yurid. We say عايز. So then, like, shouldn't we be singing a Sha'b عايز isqat nizam? And then somebody said, later in the day, somebody comes back and says, no. This is a weak slogan. This is a jumla ismiya. This is a nominal sentence. Sha'b yurid. It really should be yurid al-sha'b isqat nizam. This is a stronger sentence. And I know one professor sitting right here, Professor Bakouche, would maybe even agree with that. But it was a wonder. There was arguments about the register and dialect. As far as Asif Bayat, he's absolutely central to my thinking about this. One distinction he makes is between politics of redress and politics of protest. Thinking about that distinction, redress doesn't make an appeal to some sort of moral or political community for action. It actually, politics of redress actually just goes and tries to change. Having that sort of this distinction between protest and redress and thinking of slogans is quite interesting when you look at, say, insult slogans. I'm particularly fond of insult slogans because the insult slogan, in fact, oftentimes, and if you see it being performed, say, against the police and so on, it is about redress. It is not making an appeal. It is an attempt to injure the reputation or the person on the other side of the lines. So you can use Asif Bayat in very interesting ways. In terms of co-optation, by the way, this also goes through. The slogans that cannot be co-opted are usually those that are insult or hijat, invective poetry. They're really hard to co-opt. So I actually kind of prefer them because they can't be used against you. It seems that the big co-optation, and this is my last point, is the scholarship on populism, whether it's British or coming out of an Italian, two traditions writing about populism.
both of them, I think, instruct us to have a real skepticism or fear of references to the people, simply because it is an attempt to totalize a claim, and that totalization it's once unleashed. Of course, any political actor is going to want to try it. In fact, if you look on January 28th, as soon as people start singing "Ish'ab urid isqat nizam," 2 days later, what are they singing? "Ish'ab wal geish eid wahda." The people and the army are together as one. That also comes out of other protests. You can trace that, the history of that. But in other words, that particular reference to the people, to the nation, those are going to be the most easily co-optable. So I'll leave it at that.